Those of you that have joined us, thanks for being with us. We're just going to give a few minutes for others to jump on, and then we'll get started.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Caltech-wide Social Activism Speaker Series. Thanks so much for being here today. Right before we get started, I just want to mention that if you would like to join the group that organizes this speaker series, just send an email to caltechy@caltech.edu. We'd love to have you. So we are very fortunate today to have Professor Stephen Nuño-Perez. He's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Northern Arizona University, and the director of communications and senior analyst at Latino Decisions, a research firm specializing in understanding the political opinions and attitudes of Latinos. He's also a contributor to NBC News Latino section, and his research explores the relationship between Latinos and the American political system, which is what he'll be speaking about today. If you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the Q&A, but we're gonna wait till the end to ask questions, but you can add questions throughout, and then we'll moderate those at the end. So without further ado, can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation to share some data, share a little bit about what I do. I'm in Flagstaff, Arizona, if maybe some of you have heard it. Arizona, everyone thinks of saguaro cacti, but there's not any cacti up in Flagstaff. We're surrounded by a forest, a pine forest. We're about 7,000 feet in elevation. It's really pretty up here. I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up in Alhambra, so down the street from Caltech, and it would take me about 10 minutes to drive into Pasadena. And so I'm very familiar with the area. I also spent a year at Pasadena City College, right down the street from Caltech as well. So many friends that go to and went to Pasadena Poly, again right down the street from Caltech, and so it's nice to speak to folks who are at a place that I'm very familiar with, at least from the outside. So I'm going to talk to you about mobilization and integration of Latino political power in America. And I'm going to share a lot of information about of course, the the election that we just had. We had, last year working with Latino Decisions, did a lot of polling of Latinos, and last year, of course, was a very kind of unique moment, because not only because of the election, but of course because of COVID. And so we're going to look at some of the impact that may have had on the election as well. There we go. So after the election, right? I mean, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion in the media about Latinos, and there was a lot of headlines saying there's no such thing as a Latino vote, right? And so we saw this from various sources and places, along the internet. Many people were surprised that Latinos voted for Trump at the numbers that they did. We'll look at some of those numbers. But surprises should not have been part of that conversation, because if you've been looking at the Latino vote, which of course I have, I'm writing a book on Latino Republicans with a co-author, Lisa Sanchez, over at University of Arizona. And so we're kind of looking at this, what a lot of people in the media and popular narratives, activists, kind of portray this, Latino Republican as a contradiction in terms, and it really isn't. And if you've been following partisan politics and Latino politics for at least the last 40 years or so, it wouldn't be surprising to see the kind of support that Trump got amongst Latinos. So is there a Latino vote? First looking at, when you look at it this way, right, and you go through the various states in which there are significant numbers of Latinos present, yeah, there is a Latino vote. When you're talking about any kind of vote where 70% of a group is voting for one person or one party, and we'll look at some of that in a bit. A lot of the media likes to say this is not a monolithic vote. Absolutely, it's not a monolithic vote. It's very complicated. It's very complex. But is there a Latino vote? When you look at it this way, yeah, it's a pretty, it's a pretty good shot that you're going to get a lot of voters voting for you if you're a Democrat. Does that mean there's no Latino vote? I don't think so. Does it mean it's more complex than that? Absolutely. So I think a lot of the post-election narratives about, well, there's no Latino vote is obviously false. But I think it raises questions about the complexity of the Latino vote. And when we look at the complexity of the Latino vote, we are therefore admitting that there is a Latino vote. So it is complex, and we'll look at some of that complexity. But in general, there is a group out there that the institutions, the parties, the mechanisms of mobilization and integration certainly do look at this as a distinct group of people. Looking at the presidential vote by subgroup, we can see that Biden overwhelmingly won the vote amongst every group here. There is some variation, and we saw throughout the year, we saw men were kind of emerging as a particular group. And you might remember, I think around September, October, the Biden campaign had come out with their outreach program for men in Nevada. And I think this was a recognition of some of the data that was coming in through the polling, that perhaps Trump was disproportionately being successful in his mobilization of Latino men. And perhaps that was a result. It was Biden kind of specifically targeting Latino men in places like Nevada. So gender was an important, was an important group or variable in looking at this. And you can see some age breakdowns. There was a lot of conversation with Bernie, and there has been a kind of a gender gap with among Latinos with Bernie. We may have heard that the the socialist took over the Democratic Party in Nevada, and this has been a political movement that has been going on now for several decades, and young people are at the forefront of a lot of that political change within the Democratic Party. Looking at by national origin, there, part of the complexity of the Latino vote, right, is when we think of Latinos, I think by now, over the last 20 or 30 years, one of the mantras that academia has emphasized over the last 20 or 30 years was we're not a monolith, and it's kind of interesting that after 30 years of saying we're not monolithic, now a lot of academics are saying, well, there is a Latino vote, right? We are a group, but here's part of those distinctions is national origin, and we'll look a little bit in after and how this kind of manifests in different types of voting for the parties. But strong support for among Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. Not as strong support amongst Cubans, Central Americans, and South Americans. Arizona is one of the success stories of the Democratic Party's mobilization of Latinos. And this is kind of interesting because Latinos, right, you may be familiar with what the politics in Arizona. We have things like Joe Arpaio, who's the sheriff in Maricopa County. Maricopa County makes up the vast majority of the population in Arizona. Sheriff Joe Arpaio was a mobilizing force for the Latinos, Latino community in Maricopa County. And this is in the early 2000s. Of course, there's an economic boom, largely driven by the housing market in Arizona. And Latinos are pushing forward for change within the system, largely within the Democratic Party. And we're starting to see how this is reaping rewards for the Democrats. If you had said in 2010 that we would have a majority of our Congress, of our congressional delegation being Democrat, both of our US senators being Democrat, we have 3 or 4 statewide representatives, Secretary of State, Secretary of Education are Democrats. A lot of this is driven, most of it is driven by Hispanic voters, and recently driven by a lot of Democratic outreach to the Native American community in Arizona. So here we see the percent share vote for Biden, the Democrats, and the percent of precincts that are Latino. And as we see more Latinos, we see more vote share for the Democratic Party. Similar results in Texas and in Pennsylvania. We'll talk a little bit about Texas, and a lot of folks were wondering, what happened in Texas, and I got some things to say about that, but similar relationship here. The higher percentage that the precinct is Latino, the more likely they are to be Democrat share. A lot when you're looking at Pennsylvania, again, part of the complexity, about 500,000 Puerto Ricans are in Pennsylvania. There are two congressional districts, 1 in 10 in Philadelphia, and what's the other one in Pennsylvania? I can't remember. Largely influenced by Puerto Rican voters, and here you have Texas, and we'll talk about that again in a little bit. House vote by state, again, similar to when we're looking at the vote share for president. You can see here Florida does stand out amongst the other states. We'll look a little bit at that later, but overall you see the same patterns emerge, right? And when we're looking at these sorts of patterns, this does look like there is in fact a Latino vote. Similar patterns here by Senate. Mark Kelly in Arizona did very well with Latinos, with not as a visible outreach program to Latinos, but certainly a strong strong outreach program tied to the national party coming into Arizona to reach out to Latinos. And you may notice in the last vote for the minimum wage, Mark Kelly voted for it and Kristen Sinema voted against it. I thought that was really interesting, and I think Kristen Sinema maybe has a perception of her limitations, perhaps as a woman. That may be part of it. Mark Kelly has to run for office in 2 years, and he certainly didn't feel like that was going to hinder his chances of running again and winning again in 2 years. But certainly Sinema does, and I think that is a reflection of how she feels her strongest support, or her probably weakest support, is probably in places like Scottsdale, where she did pretty well, but perhaps doesn't have the same amount of flexibility that Mark Kelly does. Okay, moving referendum on. Yeah, he dominated. Him and he kind of dominated the scene. He's massive personality, right? Donald Trump. And so this really was a referendum on Trump. And when we asked Latinos about his performance on COVID, one of the things that was pretty unique about this last year during the campaigns was COVID-19 really just sort of sucked the air out of the room politically. I mean, it was the dominant issue on the minds of Latinos. There wasn't even a second issue. It was 50% of Latinos wanted some answers to COVID. And really there was no second issue. We're looking down, jobs in the economy, obviously, but we're looking, that was way down in 20%. Yeah, Latinos, really 67% thought that he ignored the warnings. This really kind of hurt him as well when he caught COVID. We saw he actually, his support amongst Latino men, dropped a lot when he caught COVID. And we were thinking that was it's this perception, right? That Trump had tried to make himself look like this very kind of macho, strong arm kind of guy. Then he catches COVID, he's in the hospital. I think that kind of hurt that image amongst Latinos, Latino men. This number changed a lot when he caught COVID as well, and then kind of regressed back to the norm right around 67%. So his performance with COVID was very, very important. Another thing that we had noticed last year was typically Latinos answer these kinds of questions when they're asked about addressing racial issues. It is typically addressed in terms of immigration and hostility towards immigration. And that usually is scores higher in concern for Latinos. This is the first time, I believe, that Latinos were actually saying that racial issues in general were more important. So Latinos were looking at the Trump's rhetoric, the Republican Party, and racial discrimination was a big issue. So here, 62% of Latinos said that racism and discrimination against the community increased. And this was also a very important issue. And it was different. People, were noticing that this wasn't necessarily an anti-immigrant administration. It was just a racist administration. And that was a different framing of the administration from 2016 to 2020. You may have noticed during the campaign, the Trump administration really didn't focus much on immigration. And I think that Latinos were kind of were picking up on that as well. Here, this is the issues. 55%, the pandemic and then jobs in the economy, and healthcare costs. These were the top issues throughout the year. And when you're looking again, immigration reform, 16%, very low. We have seen immigration reform go up to 50% at certain times in certain states. Like Nevada, I believe, hit 50% in 2016 in one survey. So to look at it and see it at 16%, especially when we're looking at the Trump administration, was kind of surprising, right? As you would probably expect this to be a little bit higher. But when we think back about the campaigns, the messaging of the Trump campaign, this largely was not an issue. 2016, obviously, the wall and build the wall, and Mexico's going to pay for the wall, and his announcement where president, focused on immigrants coming in and not bringing in their best and all this stuff. That was not part of the messaging of the Republican Party and the Trump administration, as strong as it was in 2016. So we can see that impact here on the issues that Latinos were concerned about. There's a lot of partisan differences among Latinos in their answers to a lot of these questions that we were asking throughout the year. So here's an interesting question we're asking: does Donald Trump show that he truly cares about Latino voters? And depending on who you were, right, 73% of Republican Latinos, these are only Latinos, said that he truly cares, and only 12% of Democrat Latinos said that he truly cares. That hostility number, 30% for Democrats and 7% for Republicans, was also very notable as well. Partisanship had a huge influence, of course, and we saw it actually in June, July. And we're very concerned about the partisan messaging on mail-in voting. The hostility towards mail-in ballots by the Republican Party was actually having a huge impact on the likelihood of these folks to send in their mail-in ballots. So partisan messaging was having a huge impact. So 84% of Democrats said, President Trump ignored early warning signs, and because of his mismanagement, millions of Americans became sick. And Republican Latinos obviously were far more friendly towards Trump, and only 25% said that it was his fault. 74% said that it's unfortunate, but there's nothing he could have done differently. So this partisan difference was throughout a lot of these issues. This is probably one of the bigger issues that I think, and we've seen some research on this, where there's large partisan differences on perceptions of racism. And here we can see, over the past 4 years, do you think racism and discrimination has increased? This is actually reversed. That should be on the right. Democrats, and on the left should be Republicans. Sorry about that. So perceptions of racism, we see big differences. So like I said, COVID kind of sucked the air out of the room. And when we look, a quarter of Latinos lost a job. And we can see here the differences in losing jobs by age, and how that's how Latinos were impacted throughout. I worked on the National Association of Latino elected officials weekly tracking poll from September through November. And we saw the number of Latinos who said that they knew someone who died from coronavirus reached upwards of 44% by November. So nearly half of Latinos, 44% of Latinos said that they knew someone or knew of someone who died from COVID. So this is a very traumatic event for Latinos. We can look at the essential workers, how Latinos overwhelmingly sort of lean on those sorts of jobs. This was a huge impact on Latinos. 9% of households said they knew someone who had contracted coronavirus. Nationally, you can see a little bit of differences there between the urban and the rural folks, but overall we see there's a pretty uniform impact on coronavirus and on the Latino community. So Kamala Harris was a lot of folks were looking at how this is going to impact Latinos. And I look a little bit ahead here. Coalition politics is going to become more important for Latinos, especially in places like Georgia. And we just saw Georgia have an election in which you see Stacey Abrams doing reach out campaigns to Latinos. And we're going to see more and more of that. This was an interesting sort of, taste of how might Latinos respond to Black candidates, or candidates of color that aren't Latino. Kamala Harris had probably, I think, if I remember correctly, she had the most diverse staff in the Senate, and had amongst the highest number of Latinos working in her staff in the U.S. Senate. And so she had integrated, and I guess you guys are from California, know very well that she ran against a Latina and won, and won a large part of Latino votes against a Latina candidate, right? So we see here some, we were interested in looking at the enthusiasm over having Kamala Harris as a vice president, and you see here 43% of Latinos said they were more enthusiastic, with much or somewhat. Go down to look at Cubans, much less, and I think, and this did have an impact. I think was one of the more understated impacts of the campaign or of the election season was race, especially in places like in South Florida. Voting to represent and support community. This is a lot of Latinos still have, a very strong partisan, affiliation and loyalty, and half of Latinos are saying that they're voting to support their candidate. Just 23% said they're voting to support represent their community. So partisan views are very influential, which is why when we're talking about mobilization, registration is so important. You register someone into a party, you've got them hooked in for the party to do that mobilization and outreach on election day, and partisan loyalties are very important. There was a lot of criticism of the Biden campaign throughout the year. If you may recall, at one point, I believe he was in North Carolina, this Hispanic kid shows up and says, hey, do you want to apologize for the Obama administration's immigration policies? And Biden basically told him, if you don't like it, you should vote for Donald Trump. And that was kind of a very clear indicator of how the Biden campaign was going to sort of look at any attempt by Latinos to pressure him on these sorts of issues. And he was very unapologetic about the Obama administration's immigration. Roughly 3 million people were deported under the Obama administration's immigration system. And so perhaps that had some influence on Latinos. I think a lot of activists, perhaps in Nevada, Arizona, perhaps were hoping to influence Biden more and continue to influence him more on that issue. But when we look at the outreach numbers, he actually exceeded Hillary Clinton on the outreach numbers, and so he was reaching out to Latinos. And again, COVID was very weird, right? Is the Republicans really basically didn't believe in COVID-19. So they were knocking on doors, and we know by the literature that knocking on doors is probably the most effective way to reach out to folks. And the Biden campaign, the Democrats were doing mostly phone calls, a lot of online stuff, a lot of ads, and trying to find ways to reach out to Latinos. And one of the ways we saw were the Republicans and then the Democrats looking at ads on Sunday. So a lot of folks were going to church on Sundays through some online venue. And so as they started targeting those sorts of venues later on in the campaigns, when they started figuring out that how are we supposed to reach these folks if we can't knock on their doors? Republicans, of course, had no problem knocking on doors because they really didn't think about, or that was sort of the framework there, or the narrative was COVID wasn't a thing. Here's that truly cares question. And again, you see here, 47% Cubans probably stand out. We've seen this as a pretty much a feature of Latino politics now for a very long time. The Cuban community, largely tied to the history of their immigration flows, but we're starting to see a lot of that changing. Has been changing for a long time, but very persistent support amongst the Cuban community for the Republican Party and for Donald Trump. A lot of discussion within the Latino community amongst themselves, encouraging friends to register to vote. And again, this is perhaps the largest barrier to participation for Latinos is registration. And when you look at places like Texas, they have a very difficult registration regime in their states. Arizona is difficult. Arizona is one of the easiest places in the country to vote. One of the most difficult places in the country to actually register. And one of the big barriers in Arizona is you have to be registered 30 days before the election to vote. So outreach efforts in Arizona are difficult because you have to do the outreach before 30 days before the election to get them registered to vote. So here we're looking at a lot of family and friends encouraging each other to register and vote. Here's the outreach numbers. Kind of interesting, Puerto Ricans. A lot of folks think of, well, Puerto Ricans are, they're citizens when they're born, and so they should be integrated, and that's not really necessarily true because of Hurricane Maria and hurricanes thereafter. There's been a lot of migration of Puerto Ricans into the United States, into the mainland, I think in 2018 there was a large support amongst Puerto Ricans for the Republicans. There's a lot of surprise. People were surprised about that. But I think what they forgot was that a lot of these Puerto Ricans that were coming in from Puerto Rico were new voters, and they're in a Republican state, right? So if you're a new voter, you come into a Republican state. Rick Scott had been very favorable to the Puerto Rican community, at least in perception. You get off the plane, you see the governor there, and he's welcoming you into into Miami or Orlando. I guess I'm going to vote for this guy, right? And so there was a lot of work to be done in the Democratic Party to reach out to Puerto Ricans in Florida. I think they're doing it, but there's a lot of perception that, oh, they're Puerto Rican, they'll just vote for Democrats. That is not true. So outreach efforts, we see higher outreach efforts by the Democrats and the system in general to reach out to these folks to get their vote. So again, Democrats outperforming the Republicans in nearly every place, every group here. Again, Cubans are the only ones that we see some competition there, but in general, the Democrats are way outperforming the Republican Party. I have 10 minutes. Okay, cool. I think I'm right about time. This is the same in a different format. So again, here you see Democrats outstripping the Republicans. One of the other things that a lot of folks don't talk about is when we're thinking about outreach and mobilization of Latinos, the Republicans have a more focused kind of outreach program, right? They, South Florida, they go into some rural areas. Texas, there's a well-established Latino, Hispanic, Republican civic organizations and party organizations already established there. They don't have the same sort of difficulties that the Democrats have, right? So the Democrats are basically a national outreach program for Latinos, and they have to consider, different groups and dialects and accents in New York, Florida, Texas, Nevada. I mean, it's a much more complex outreach program for the Democrats than for the Republicans, and I think that is often forgotten. Going back to this, right? How do we look at this? And I think it's, looking at the numbers, we can see that, there are general tendencies of how Latinos behave, right? We can make some, we can look at how Latinos behave in terms of the election, in terms of the issues that are affecting them, and their perceptions of the system and how that system looks at them. We do indeed see a Latino vote, but I do think that our framework for how we look at Latinos needs to be a little bit more nuanced when communicated to the general public. I think in academia in general, there is a lot going on. It is very complex, but a lot of this has to do with how this group, how this community is communicated to the general public. And I think that is probably one of the biggest problems. And I worked for NBC News for 8 years, right? And I wrote something like 250 articles for them, trying to, work on explaining the Latino vote to a more general audience. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do that because you want your readers to come away with a specific point, but you also don't want to bore your readers and get them lost in the weeds and in a lot of complexities that ultimately you don't have a whole lot of time to capture their attention in online with the articles. One of the things that we asked, this is in the NALEO, the survey, the tracking poll, is we asked Latinos for their favorability of George Bush. And we started asking this question because we had noticed that there was these differences amongst Latinos and how they were perceiving or supporting the parties. And we were getting a lot of questions from the media, like, well, is this, what's going on here? And I think one of the reasons why we asked this question was really to kind of reset and say, like, look, there's always been a Republican Latino group, right? This has always been a feature of the Republican Party. And even though we see that Donald Trump in general was looked at very unfavorably, when they look at the old party, right? When they look at, and we ask them, what's your favorability of George Bush? Half of Latinos said they had a favorable, perception of him. And when we think of the election in 2000 and 2004, where roughly 40% of Latinos voted for George Bush, I think there is a group of Latinos out there that were former Republicans or have a more positive picture of the Republican Party, and perhaps waiting for that person to emerge. Donald Trump was not that person. And when you think about the past, when you think about George Bush and his 40%, the partisan vote amongst Latinos has generally been pretty stable. We're generally looking at between 30 and 40% of Latinos voting for Republicans. This is the high watermark support for Bush. Low watermark was Trump. Does that mean from the media's eyes that well, Latinos, what explains this? Latinos have kind of generally always had a group that was very supportive of Republicans. Why I put some gender, masculinity was a huge issue, right? When you think about Donald Trump and his appeal to patriarchal views, his macho sort of appeal. I hate saying machismo. I largely think machismo is a gringo stereotype of Latinos. I don't think Latinos are any more patriarchal than whites. But Trump did have this kind of caudillo, sort of appeal to Latinos, a very strong personality. And I think that did have an impact on support by gender. We also forget that Hispanic is an ethnicity, and with a very long racial history as well, that is very anti-Native. I also think that a lot, and we saw a lot yesterday in the news, talking about how the Democrats underestimated how socialism was going to influence Latinos. I don't buy that. I don't think Latinos are anti-socialist. I think that socialism is a dog whistle for being anti-Black. And when we think about how that influenced a lot of voters, we can see that the more anti-Black you were, the more anti-socialist you were. So, and not only that, but Latinos were very supportive of socialist policies. You know, whether it's the minimum wage, schools, and healthcare. They're recipients and supporters of these types of programs. For them to then turn around and say that they're not favorable to socialism, I don't buy that. But again, I think that's a very gringo media narrative, right? Like, oh, Latinos come from Venezuela, and and they understand socialism. And I think no, they come from Venezuela. They're upper middle class, folks who are fleeing an authoritarian regime, and they largely put a white face on success in the United States. And when they see images of Black Lives Matter, of Black people going out there, and there's this narrative that the Republicans have painted that these folks are tearing the country apart. I think that has an impact on how people from different countries who are immigrants coming in here, and they largely see American success in white face, to then look at Black people protesting, and in the media, that becomes, and then the Republicans say the socialists are coming after you. I think that is a dog whistle. It is not necessarily that they are opposed to democratic socialist policies like healthcare and education and minimum wage. And I think any of you grad students who want to do a paper on that would be a slam dunk paper to write. So as we looked at before, denial of racism, a couple of people have been writing on that. And how important that is in determining partisan choice. And there is this kind of aspirational component of the Latino community where they say, like, well, you just have to ignore, what people say to you, and just, go to work, right? And not listen to what people are saying, and just kind of do, move forward with your life, right? And there's this kind of denial of racism and economic aspirations out there. A lot of first, second gen Hispanics are coming here with this perception of the American dream, and we've seen how that wanes as we go through the third and fourth generation of Latinos. The immigrant story, obviously Cubans who came here and largely benefit from Republican policies and animosity towards Castro, obviously has been and will continue to be an influence on the Cuban vote, and working on down Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and Central Americans obviously have their own stories, and those stories will obviously be influential as well. Finally, looking at the Latino vote and how we frame this, right? And when we think about in a more granular way, when we think about the differences between California and Arizona, or when we think about Arizona and Nevada, we're very similar in makeup. In the number of Latinos, they're basically 30% Latinos, but very different outputs from the political system. Looking at these sorts of areas, one of the big models that I've kind of looked at was when we're thinking about Nevada political participation amongst Latinos, it's probably better to look at it through this civic labor kind of movement, right? And that there's a system already in place in Nevada because of the unions that can take that energy and that population and group and turn that into political power. In Arizona, they don't have the same sort of laws for unions, right? So it's a right to work state. Very difficult to organize without that institution in place. And so it's taken longer in a place like Arizona, where they've had to establish civic organizations in response to SB 1070 in 2010, Joe Arpaio in the 2000s, and all of the hostility from the Republican Party, the recall effort of Senator, I can't remember his name. So all of that has required a lot of civic organizing by Latinos. And so when we think about like, oh, it's different, Latinos are, there's no Latino vote. It's like, no, there's just, it's happening within a certain context, right? And this context is influencing how the outputs of those states are going, right? Political existing partisan relationships, issue preferences. There was a lot of talk about how in South Texas, Latinos were supporting Donald Trump more, a lot more this year than in 2016. We're looking at that. It appears to be, number one in not very many counties, but also in counties that are rely on border jobs. So when we're looking about the detention apparatus of the Trump administration, we were seeing that the closer Latinos were to that apparatus, the more likely they were to support Trump, and not because they were opposed to, they were not opposed to the treatment of Latinos. They really were just looking at, well, if Trump wins, we're going to have more jobs down here at the border. And so that was a big influence. The overwhelming center of Latino politics in Texas is in the cities. And we see that growing every year. And we can see now city councils and city police chiefs, all Latino, and all fighting with the state party. And we're going to continue to see that from the ground and looking at it from above as well for a very long time. When we look at Texas, you're basically looking at 5 or 6 Arizonas. And so it's a very large state, very complex, and whites in Texas are 40% of the state, but they basically have 100% of the power because they run, the Republican Party runs the state politics. So very difficult there. I think we need to look more at the colonial history, the racial history of Latinos to help explain more of the nuances of the Latino vote. I think it's time to look at some of the dirty laundry of our own community and to see how that is influencing partisan votes and the Latino vote in general. In general, we have tended to, I think, to stay away from those types of conversations, at least in political science. We've obviously seen a lot of it in the critical race folks, the women gender studies folks. We've seen a lot of that, but it's usually we're kind of, we understand that it's a very touchy subject because obviously the problem is not Latino racism. The problem is more white supremacy, patriarchy in general, and we don't want to detract from that and to give fodder and to others to say, oh well, Latinos are racist too, so what are you complaining about us for? So obviously that's a very touchy subject, but I think more introspection about how these forces are influencing our community is important. And I think that's it. So, and I think I'm at 50 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting.
I stopped
so
sharing. I don't know if that's good.
Oh, sorry. So I just want to mention again, please put any questions in the Q&A. Also, if you'd like to ask your question live, you can raise your hand and I believe we can unmute you if you would prefer to ask your question that way. So there's one question put in the chat during the talk that you actually ended up commenting on, but I think maybe if you could maybe reiterate what you said and comment again on about this perception of like machismo culture among Latinos. So the question is sort of about how that might have played a role in the difference between support for Hillary and Biden.
Yeah, we did, and we continue to see a gender gap in the support for the parties. I think I think we often understate the appeal of the Republicans and to the country in general, right? When we think about Donald Trump and a lot of people say like Donald Trump has no values, right? He will say anything because he's Donald Trump. He only cares about Donald Trump. That's not true. Donald Trump really cared about three things. Donald Trump was the first thing he cared about, but really he also cared about patriarchal power, and he cared about white supremacy. And you can tell that throughout his presidency, he really didn't violate those three tenets of the Trump administration. Was basically, taking care of Donald Trump, but also taking care of white male power. And everybody in his administration was beholden to that. Woman, man, African American, that was the administration's central values. That has an appeal to Latinos, and if you ever want to trigger Latino men, just start using the word Latinx, right? And Latinx really kind of erases sexual, gender. And when you erase gender, you're erasing power. And you can see how Latino men often respond negatively when someone says, "Don't call me Latinx," because that's not how I, and it's always from the men, right? Not always from the men, but generally from the men, where you see it's an inclusive term that is trying to integrate the experiences of women and of other sexualities and of having a more nuanced perception of what gender is. And of course, that cuts into the power of men. The Spanish language is literally a patriarchal language. And so the Republicans benefited from that, right? And so that was one of the things that they benefited from was appealing to that patriarchal power. Is it necessarily like, oh, well, they're Latinos, they just like machismo, right? There's like, 70% of white men voted for Trump. No one's talking about machismo with white men. Patriarchal power is important, and men benefit from a patriarchal society, and Latinos come from a patriarchal, history that was instilled through colonialism, and so that has been a kind of central force for the Republicans in the Latino community.
Sorry, muted myself. It's like we have someone who wants to ask a question live. Maria?
Hi, Maria.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. Great information. Question, it's starting to get a little bit annoying with the word Latinx.
Yeah.
I really have a hard time with that. And I also, one of the other things is that when they're asking you what background you are, doesn't give you they give you a lot of different other ones, but nothing about Latino is you have to use white or because you're not Asian, because you're not Hawaiian, and I don't know how to say it without explaining what I meant. It doesn't keep it that by the other word, it can be white. So why is that? And thank you so much for that information.
That largely comes from the census, right? And how the institutions and our government counts us. And we've come to be accustomed to looking at our identity as a racial identity and an ethnic identity. And so most Latinos think of themselves as white. So if you ask them a racial question, excuse me, most Latinos will say that they're white. And so when we look at the census, you often see, non-Hispanic whites, right? And these are whites who did not say that who said they were not Hispanic. And so this was, this is a relic of how we we created identity, and this goes back to the 60s. Latinx, right? Only 2%. We've asked this question many times in our surveys. Just 2%, or 3% maybe, will say that they identify as Latinx. I think this is part of the complexity.
And this is the new area. I'm sorry to interrupt you. And this is new, right? Because
I
remember last time that I did the census, it didn't have this. It's just now that it's putting us in that box.
The race and the ethnic question have been around for a long time. In 2000, they began to allow us to allow everybody to mark multiple racial categories, and that's a change over the last 20 years. And so, I think it is complex, but also, when we think about Latinx, the communication of that word is really to communicate inclusivity, right? It's really to say that I acknowledge that Latino is more than just gender, and it includes multiple communities, and really it's recognition of that diversity in the community. And so a lot of outreach campaigns say that they're the Latinx outreach campaign, but when they actually go into communities, they use whatever the local customs are, right? And so if you were in Flagstaff and you go down to 4th Street, everyone would say you're, the Mexican community, or the Latino community, because that must make sense. But the actual committee is the Latinx committee, because you're trying to communicate inclusion. We're not only looking for, Latino men or women. We're looking for, queer, bi, trans, all of those are part of the community. And when you look at the history of the Latino community, of the Latino, in Mexico and in South, it has historically been a very open community to those different identities as well.
Thank you so much. And so if my daughter is the 3rd generation born here, that category will be to her, because I'm still really proud to say Mexican, and still she's the same way.
That's a funny thing about Latinx is it's kind of funny to see, Chicanos growing up, a lot of the Chicanos in the 60s and 70s, right, were fighting to bring that word into the, the political lexicon, right? And now Latinx is coming on. A lot of the old veteranos, the Chicanos, are saying, what's this Latinx thing? We're Chicanos. And so I find a little bit of humor in that. So in the census, in a lot of places, they'll ask the race question. Are you white, black? There's a lot of black Afro-Latinos out there. So a lot of Latinos will say they're African-American, and they're Hispanic. And so especially when you're looking at the Northeast, and in the South, there's a lot of Afro-Latinos there as well. So having the multiple question where you're asking for race and ethnicity. There's also in the long form a question on origin. So from Mexico or Puerto Rico or Cuba or whatever Latin American country, or that is, I think, only on the long form. So if you don't get it, it's because you didn't get the long form.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So it's 1 p.m. so I know people might have to go. Thank you so much for coming. I have one more question if you have a few more minutes. So I lived for some time in Texas, and there was definitely this perception there on the Democratic side that Texas would be blue, as long as if everyone could vote, in particular because of this large Latino population that has a very low turnout rate. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, and how accurate that perception is, because of course in the last election, I think a lot of people were surprised, especially in the southern part of the state, when a lot of the Latino vote went Republican.
for the last 20 years, right, we've been talking about how Texas is going to turn blue. I think really it's going to be another 10 or 15 years, because when you look at the Democrats are chipping away, and I think they lost by 600,000 votes last year, but the year before that it was like 1.2 million and then 3 million, and so it's changing. This is why when you think about the Republicans and how focused they are on voting, they understand, they can read the tea leaves, that given their current outreach and who they're appealing to, the only way that they can survive without changing that is to make it more difficult to participate. And so this is why literally Texas is the hardest state in the country to register. It's got to be top 5, and so this is the central strategy of the Republican Party, is really just to keep people from voting and erecting barriers to participation. That's only going to last so long, right? And we can see in places like Arizona where that has been, I think Arizona Republicans kind of got caught sleeping in 2010 with redistricting, and how that has helped the Latino vote. And then also with voting, registration is difficult in Arizona, but voting is pretty easy. And as the civic organizations have registered more and more people, the ease with which you can vote in Arizona has meant high levels of participation. And now, of course, the Republicans in Arizona are really trying to make sure that even voting is more difficult in Arizona. I don't think Ducey is going to support those kinds of bills. And if you notice, Ducey is, he's a Republican, but he's probably one of the most moderate Republicans in the country. When we look at Texas, we see an extremely hostile party. That's really the only way that they can stay in power, is to maintain authoritarian, sort of an authoritarian system. Why do Latinos support Republicans? I think one reason why is because if you want anything in Texas, right, you got to be Republican. And so if you're in the business community, if you're in any community in which you need access, you have to go Republican, right? And so I think that's why it's so scary for the Republicans, because once that flips, and now the Democrats are where you go to for power, that's going to make it very difficult for Republicans to crawl back from without changing who they are. And it's already changing at the cities. I mean, you go to Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin. I mean, that's all, you can't win there without, and Republicans have tried to split the votes, usually with an African-American candidate, right? So I think in Dallas and in San Antonio, right, is you put a moderate to conservative, Black Republican there to kind of help split the white vote. And that's how you win, right? And those kinds of tricks and are band-aids for what is eventually going to happen, and that's that writing is already on the wall.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really, really interesting. So there's, if you have a few more minutes,
Yeah,
there's one
sure.
more question in the Q&A. You mentioned Castro as a powerful influence on how the Cuban community votes. Do you consider the current political climate in the countries of origin of recent immigrants when analyzing their voting tendencies?
Yeah, we always ask an origin question. And so what a lot of folks were the Venezuelan community in South Florida was very influential. And there's a really interesting dynamic going on in South Florida where you have recent Cuban migrants coming into South Florida, not tied to the Castro regime. And they are working more essential labor type jobs for Venezuelans, right, who are coming in and hiring Cuban labor. And there's this really interesting dynamic going on in South Florida that is way more complex than what people are sort of saying. Yeah, we do ask that question always. It is very important. How you got here is important. And we see this often also in the Asian American community with the Vietnamese community, and how influential Republicans have been in the Vietnamese community because of origin, and because of the integration of those folks into the party since that time. So it becomes a family, in South Florida, it becomes a family, sort of, a project, right? Where your dad was a Republican, your grandfather was Republican, and so you're a Republican as well. And that's hard to break, which is why registration of immigrants is so important.
Another question just popped up. Do you see any similarities between the Latinx Hispanic vote and the Asian American Pacific Islander vote? Just wondering, because both groups don't traditionally fit into our larger Black-white narrative of race in America.
Yeah, and yes, and what's interesting about the Asian American community and Latinos is depending on where you go, Latinos are going to have to get used to more coalition politics. Asian Americans have already had to deal with coalition politics because they're almost never a majority minority group, right? Perhaps in the Northwest, you can get dominant Asian communities. In California, you basically have two areas where there's close to a plurality of Asian Americans. So Asian Americans are used to coalition politics. Latinos are not in places like California or Nevada, right? They're the dominant minority group, and politicians look at it as a group, right? And Latinos are used to being viewed in that way. Moving forward, I think Latinos are going to have to get used to more of the type of coalition politics that Asian Americans have had to work through because of their numbers in places like Georgia and in places like North Carolina, and in Michigan, Wisconsin, where Latinos are not the dominant minority group, and they're going to need to work with other minority groups, other dominant minority groups. And right now, I think we're seeing a lot of that transition where everybody is sort of like Asian Americans, and Republicans continue to try to chip away at that, where we look at things like affirmative action, right? So if Republicans are saying, well, Latinos and Blacks are taking spots for Asian Americans, and we need to do away with that, right? And that appeals to a lot of folks because there are our own stereotypes about the Asian American community, and so that is something that the party and the groups we have, like in Phoenix, we have a large Indian American population, and it's difficult when the Latinos in Arizona have numbers. We have people, right? What we don't have is money. And when you look at a lot of recent immigrants who come with educations and PhDs and big jobs, they don't have numbers, but they have money. And that conversation requires some sophistication, right? Is when you're looking at Asian American communities who come in these sorts of immigrant flows, and most of their businesses, most of their social groups are interacting with whites, and then Latinos asking them, saying, hey, why don't you join our coalition? That requires a lot of conversation and a lot of very careful ways of discussing what we're trying to get, what we're trying to do. And Latinos are really trying to figure that out in places like North Carolina and Georgia. In Georgia, you have to work with the Black community, right? The immigrant community, you're looking at maybe 4, 5, 6% of Latinos in Georgia. But when you're looking at a race in which you win by 1% in Georgia constantly, that's your win right there, right? And so Latinos are important, but obviously they're going to have to work with the existing coalitions in places in the South, and perhaps hopefully learn from the Asian American community on how to do that in places other than California, Texas, Arizona, Nevada.
Hey, thank you so much. Yeah, we're already a little over time, so I'll let you go, but thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. I learned a lot. Yeah, so thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. I'll clap.
Thanks everybody. I appreciate it. I'll just pick off. Have fun. Take care.